This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, winter of 1961, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the country's leading African-American historians and sociologists and activists, well, Du Bois formally joins the Communist Party at this time in 1961. He, of course, was the founder way back in 1909 of the NAACP, but had plenty of disagreements with that organization about the best way to advocate and agitate for black liberation. Over the decades, Du Bois had lots of political evolutions and moments, but then here we are in 1961 at the age of 93 years old, and he makes this announcement that he is joining the Communist Party. Really interesting chapter in the life of one of the country's most consequential figures. And it says a lot about Du Bois and about the early 60s civil rights movement and, of course, what the Communist Party meant in that moment. So here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
We've touched on Du Bois, but I think it's probably worth doing a little Du Bois 101, especially around this central theme of like political and ideological evolution that goes all the way back to the founding of the NAACP and the split, or however you want to characterize it, Kelly, with the NAACP. So do you want to paint a little picture of him as a, I don't know, as an ideological seeker, which maybe lets us understand this moment too?
Du Bois is one of the most fascinating persons, I think, in African American history, and mostly because I think of his evolution that you see over time. I mean, he starts out, even before the NAACP, he starts out in the Niagara movement, which is this sort of short-lived, radical black faction that sort of morphs into a much more conservative NAACP. But all throughout that time leading up into his death, he is pushing for civil rights for black people. He's pushing for political rights. He's pushing for labor rights. He's advocating for workers. I mean, he is always on the front lines championing the worker, the marginalized, you name it. And you see his anti-war efforts in both World War I and in World War II. And had he lived long enough, he would have been protesting Vietnam as
Absolutely.
well. I mean, like, there's so many things about Du Bois that he is speaking up about and writing about. I mean, one of the most prolific writers, and not small little pieces either. Like, he's got these huge, several books that could be considered a magnum opus. I mean, he's done it all.
Yeah, I mean, Souls of Black Folks and Black Reconstruction are probably two of the most important books in 20th century literature. They just are. Yeah. And I think that hitting upon his peace activism is really important, Kelly, because it is a through line in his activism. It's part of what defines his, I guess, anti-communism in the 1950s. He is chairman of the Peace Information Center, which is both anti-war and anti-nuclear proliferation, which obviously is a really big concern after 1945. But it also paints him as a target to the U.S. government, not just for his Black civil rights activism, but this anti-war activism makes it possible to paint him as un-American, as a traitor, as somebody opposed to the U.S. interests. And then you add on to this a relationship with the Communist Party, and suddenly the U.S. government is having a field day with Du Bois as an outsider and an agitator.
Right.
But I don't think he's alone.
Not at all.
The crazy thing about it is that, like, in the 1930s, like, everybody Black was in the Communist Party. Like, everybody was sympathetic, if not like card carrying, sympathetic to communist ideas, because it spoke directly to the inequality and the injustice that they were facing at home, particularly in a segregated South. And so when democracy did not feel like a refuge, communism felt very attractive for Black people who were, sort of looking at the world around them and saying, this is hypocrisy.
And the Communist Party was directly organizing in Black communities and preaching a message of racial justice and racial equality. And I know we'll get into this. This does mean that Du Bois sort of paints a rosier picture of the Soviet Union than perhaps is warranted, but that you have to understand it within this tradition of the failures of the United States and the way that the Communist Party was offering something much better than what the U.S. was offering at the time.
Right. But, we've talked about on this show a lot that it means very different things to be a member or just, flirt with communism in the teens and the 30s and the 50s and the 70s, and I think that's really a big part of the story because, I mean, I take your point, Kelly, that throughout history, a lot of Black activists have found common cause with communism because they feel abandoned by capitalism. But I'm still struck by the fact that 1961 is very different from the 1920s or 30s in order to kind of do this. And, to just proclaim this, coming literally on the heels of the blacklist and the 1950s anti-communist fervor. I mean, it's just sort of really striking to me that he would look around and say, this is a good moment for me to proclaim, And I mean, King did it 5-6 years later. Right, started to talk about communism but even that, feels. 1961 is a really interesting moment for this proclamation.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I think Du Bois was like, what do I have to lose? At this point, is he 91?
93,
he's in his 90s. 93? I mean, he doesn't live that much longer, maybe a few more years after this. But what does he have to lose by making this declaration? I think, and at this time, he's living in Ghana. So he already has sort of established himself in a place that will embrace him and eventually becomes his home. And there's nothing that can sort of be taken from him by making this stand.
And at this point,
at least not politically.
Yeah. And at this point, the U.S. had taken away his passport. So he was an alienated citizen in many ways. He lost access to his passport for a big chunk of the 1950s as well. And so I think that's exactly right, Kelly. He's 93. He's living in Ghana. He believes, if not in the Soviet Union's version of communism, although he kind of believes in China's version of communism, he believes in a particular kind of communism. When he talks about it, he says, I mean, a planned way of life and the production of wealth and work designed for building a state whose object is the highest welfare of its people and not merely the profit of a part. So it's a kind of utopian vision that he is professing faith in. And you combine that with his peace activism and, it kind of makes sense that as he nears the end of his life, this is kind of where he ends up.
Yeah.
I wonder what the impact of this proclamation is, or maybe even just also a kind of larger sense of what his role is in the civil rights movement at this stage. I mean, we've mentioned on this show one of the kind of most sort of just fascinating little coincidences of history that he dies on the eve of the March on Washington in 1963. And Kelly, I don't know, tell me if I'm wrong here, but it kind of feels like he gets a shout out there, but maybe at that point his legacy and impact is faded or contested or just a little more uncomfortable. So kind of, does it gather people's attention in the early 60s when he makes a proclamation like this? What is his role in the movement?
Yeah, it's certainly I don't think his death got the kind of attention that it should have. I mean, people knew that he was a giant in the field. I think scholars long after have sort of resuscitated his memory, his standing and all of that. But because he was outside of the country for a good part of, the civil rights movement and the sort of like, the height of, think of the Montgomery bus boycott and Emmett Till and all of these major, events that are taking place. He's not a part of that. He can't be sort of front and center. And he's not a young man either. So he can't really be as active as he wanted to, even if he were still in the United States. And so I think he gets honored as an elder, and certainly for all of his contributions. But by then, they were new successors who had sort of taken over, and King is definitely that person. Bayard Rustin and other people who are doing this work on the ground. But by then, the baton has been passed.
It's interesting, and I don't know the answer to this, but especially in that moment in the late 1950s, early 1960s, eve of the March on Washington, all of the protest activism that is going to take place between this moment in 61 and 63. If Du Bois' decision to apply to become part of the Communist Party wasn't used against people like King and other Black civil rights leaders who had already kind of been tarred as communist front groups. Yeah. In some ways, like that work had already been done by J. Edgar Hoover and others in the United States, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah. But I would imagine that there was some relish on both behalf of the security state, but also on behalf of conservative opposition to the Black civil rights movement to be like, ha, we told you they were communists.
And they're like, so?
Yeah, they're like, okay.
I mean, I suppose somewhere in here it's instructive to think about kind of the difference between being anti-capitalist and, pro-communist. And I mean, I don't think Hoover had that nuance or McCarthy had that nuance.
Yeah.
I mean, there's, I guess, a whole debate about whether Malcolm X was technically a communist or not, but he was clearly an anti-capitalist, and same with King. And so, here we have someone who's sort of proclaiming that. I don't know if that's a distinction without a difference, but it is interesting how all those things get all those lines get blurred and lumped in together in this moment. So I think, Niki, to your point, like that kind of charge was already out there. Might as well own it or whatever.
Yeah. And I still think that, if given for time, people also saw the pitfalls in communism as well. Like, I think a lot of civil rights and political Black leaders are struggling with what is the most effective ideology or approach that will work. We know that capitalism doesn't work. We know that communism is a little bit better, but like, how do we, is it socialism? Is it Marxism? There's all of these different ideas about how people are trying to get to liberation. And so I think people are flexible in their sort of political stances because they're just trying to get to something that will work.
Right. It's a means to an end.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Really interesting moment. I don't know if this was a listener suggestion or not, but anyway, if it was, thank you, listener, for suggesting it. I should be better about that. But anyway, really fascinating. And we will, of course, I think, revisit Du Bois a bunch. Let's also end with a little also on this day, some other things that happened on December 5th. 1831, former President John Quincy Adams takes his seat in the House of Representatives.
In 1848, President Polk confirmed that there is gold in them thar hills and helped start the California gold rush.
Polk and his big mouth.
That's right.
I know. In 1933, the 21st Amendment is ratified, which repeals prohibition. So, cheers.
One question I have is, does every city in America have a bar called the 21st Amendment? Or was that just when I lived in D.C.?
There's 21st Amendment liquor stores, 21st Amendment bars. Yeah.
1935, Mary Maud Bethune founds the National Council of Negro Women in New York City. I don't know much about that organization. I don't know much about that movement in the 30s. We got to do an episode.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Bethune is huge. Yeah.
And then 20 years later, not saying they're connected, not saying they're not, the Montgomery bus boycott begins.
Are they connected? I mean, don't think so.
As part of a broader burst of activism that is often woman-led.
Among Black women.
Yes.
Well,
there you go. I don't know what other connections there are here, but those are some things that happened on this day, December 5th, through the ages. And of course, a reminder that we are going to revamp our newsletter going into 2024 with an eye towards gathering up some of these things, looking at some of the themes, connecting some of these dots. So you can always go subscribe to our newsletter at thisdaypod.com. where you can also become a member of Radiotopia and get a discount on merch and yada, yada, yada. But anyway, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia from PRX.